Not all fasting is created equal. It's so easy to say, it's fasting, why are you overcomplicating it? Just don't eat and then have a period of time where you eat. That is perfectly simple and easy for people that are just getting started. But if you're watching this video, you're someone that is wanting to evolve your practice of intermittent fasting with new and emerging research. I will go on record and say that things that I've talked about with 16-8 and traditional fasting still apply. No one is saying that regular intermittent fasting is bad. What we are saying is we're learning new things that you can use to make it better. And I'm talking like 2022 meta-analysis, brand new studies new. So you couldn't have possibly known 2 years ago that this was going to happen now. And we're learning more and we can capitalize on it. So there was a study in 2022 published in Nature Communications that took a look at what is called eTRF compared to mTRF. eTRF stands for early time restricted feeding and mTRF stands for midday time restricted feeding. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you're like me and probably do midday time restricted feeding for the most part. Okay, so mTRF is eating between the hours of like 11 a.m. and 8 p.m., kind of standard intermittent fasting-ish, right? eTRF was eating between the hours of 6 a.m., right smack when you wake up, and ending at 3 p.m. Okay, so quite significant differences. And then of course they also had a controlled diet that just ate whatever the heck they wanted and whenever, typical people. Results were so wild, but you have to hear this whole video because this will all make sense and be a little more practical. They found the early time restricted feeding group had significant reductions in insulin resistance compared to even mTRF. eTRF actually decreased insulin resistance more than regular midday time restricted feeding. But midday time restricted feeding dramatically improved insulin resistance far above and beyond the controlled diet. That's kind of a given. But what's wild is that the eTRF, the early time restricted feeding group, and the midday time restricted feeding group, it was a pretty like statistically insignificant change in glucose levels. What does this mean? Like, why is this happening? Well, regardless, when you're fasting, whether it's mTRF or eTRF, you're still going to have what is called physiological insulin resistance that's occurring anyway. So your glucose is going to be higher just because you're fasting. So it's not a huge surprise that there wasn't a big delta between the glucose levels. But the fact that eTRF impacted insulin resistance so much more than mTRF tells us that eTRF is getting down to the very, very core of the issue with insulin resistance, not just the superficial hyperglycemia issue. So what this is telling us is that something is happening probably more genetically and as far as gene expression and circadian genes go, that is much more than just surface level glucose. Now, I'm sure you care about body composition. I do, of course. So they also found that eTRF led to a greater body fat reduction and overall weight loss compared to midday time restricted feeding. But a thoughtful nod to mTRF, mTRF had ridiculous improvements over control. So we're not saying that 16-8 or regular intermittent fasting is bad. We're saying, let's go with some of this new stuff and sprinkle it in. They also found huge improvements in inflammation reduction with eTRF that they did not see in mTRF. But here's the kicker. Crazy improvements in gut diversity with eTRF. I don't have a real explanation for this other than the fact that it's a good thing. Okay, because one of my concerns with people that start intermittent fasting is that their eating windows are so consolidated, they don't have enough time to get the diversity in their diet. So I get concerned that their gut microbiome is going to be less diverse and that metabolically it could impact them later on down the line. However, with eTRF, there was an improvement in gut diversity. So it's really interesting. Whenever someone starts an intermittent fasting regime or changes their intermittent fasting schedule, I'm sure someone is thinking about this being like, well, maybe one group just ate less. The eTRF and the mTRF groups, they ate about the same amount of calories, but both groups did eat significantly less than the control. Okay, so no one is denying that when you're fasting, you're probably eating less calories than a normal diet, and that's probably where a lot of benefits come from. No doubt, totally agree, totally think that. But eTRF and mTRF, they ate about the same amount. So how do you explain that eTRF had better body composition results? There's obviously something going on deeper metabolically, right? Maybe we can't explain it, but it's happening. So let's look at more data, because I like meta-analysis. I like studies that look at lots of studies. So there was a study in 2022 that was a meta-analysis that reviewed 5 articles, looked at 5 studies, and it was published in the journal Review of Diabetic Studies. Okay, now they had some criteria. They wanted to look at eTRF. So the criteria was simple. People had to be fasting for a minimum of 14 hours, which isn't hard to do when you're looking for data. Okay, they also had to eat between the hours of 6 a.m. upon waking, or just upon waking in general, and eating no later than 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Whoa, that's all I have to do with eTRF? Is shrink my eating window so that I'm not eating past 3 or 5 p.m.? I could do that a few days per week easily. So with these 5 studies it looked at, 2 of the studies found that eTRF reduced glucose and insulin. Wabam, that's a win. 2 studies found that it reduced glucose only, not a huge significant improvement of insulin. Still great. 1 of the studies found that there was a bona fide improvement in insulin resistance, and a significant improvement in insulin resistance at that. Okay, so 3 out of the 5 studies showed improvements in insulin, 1 of which insulin resistance improvement, and 2 of the studies still showed improvements in fasting glucose. That's pretty cool when you look at larger data. Oh, and by the way, a lot of this happened in the absence of caloric restriction. So these changes were occurring, improvements in insulin resistance and glucose, in a lot of cases without even reducing calories, just adjusting timing with eTRF. I want to stop for a second and give a very thoughtful nod, again, to mTRF, standard midday time-restricted feeding, where you start eating at like 11 or 12 and you eat until 7 or 8. Let's just throw some positive data out there that's relatively new. There's a study that when they looked at midday TRF versus control, there was a 4.9 kilogram fat loss in midday time-restricted feeding over control. So my point in saying that is, if you can't skip dinner and do eTRF, or you're consolidating earlier in the day, even a couple days a week, you're fine. You're still fine. Like, it's still better than the normal. So please don't hate on yourself. I'm trying to give you tools to be better. But you know what's cool? For people that are like wanting to be around for a long time, watch their kids grow up, watch their kids grow up, there was a 12% reduction in the 30-year risk of a cardiac event with people that did midday time-restricted feeding over control. So even just by fasting and not reducing calories, there seems to be improvements in the risk of a cardiac event. That seriously counts for something when you're looking at just living. Data is cool. I like mechanisms. That's how I'm wired. But you can't rely on mechanistic studies because people will poke holes in them all day long. But it doesn't mean that you can't talk about it. So why is this happening? Why is eTRF so beneficial? Well, the first one is an obvious one. It's the same reason mTRF is also successful. You are reducing calories. Okay, the body is an open thermodynamic system, which means it's not black and white with calories in, calories out, but there's a large skew majority of that math and physics equation that comes into it. So you reduce calories. Get that aside. That matters. Number 2 is the metabolic switching that occurs with fasting. Now, by metabolic switching, I mean you develop a very keen ability to switch back and forth between fats and carbs. This is important because when you have someone that isn't good at switching between fats and carbs, if they're utilizing fat and all of a sudden you give them carbs, they don't respond well. If you give them a bunch of carbs and all of a sudden you give them fat, they don't respond well. So you have this delay in the mitochondrial machinery, this delay in mitochondrial utilization of these substrates. This metabolic switching, by training your body to be efficient at none or some or all, really does make you a more flexible person as far as your metabolism is concerned as you get older. It matters, and that stands whether you're mTRF or eTRF. A very big factor for both mTRF and eTRF is the reduction of oxidative stress over time. Fasting itself is a stressor. Okay, don't get me wrong. While you are fasting, you're inflicting stress. But long term, you actually reduce the stress. And this reduction in oxidative stress improves your insulin resistance. Think of a set of dominoes that are like, you have 1,000 dominoes down this beautiful line that someone set up. Okay, well, if you have oxidative stress is like pulling one of those dominoes out. So all of a sudden, all that beautiful cascade that should be happening metabolically stops. And you kind of have to like kick that domino again and start it again. And then it hits another part where there are dominoes missing. So when you have your body repaired and you have less oxidative stress, your dominoes are all in a line and everything flows seamlessly. Now, the last reason, and the reason why the eTRF seems to have the lion's share of the benefits, is that you end up having this alignment of what are called circadian clock genes. This doesn't just help you sleep. That's where people just turn it off. They're like, oh, cool, I don't care about sleep. I already sleep good. I don't need to improve sleep. No, circadian clock genes are more than just sleep. They are regulating your nighttime, daytime, whole regulation and metabolism. So eTRF is demonstrating that it is going to amplify sirtuin-1, which has to do with longevity, has to do with fat utilization, has to do with sleep, but also regulates BMAL1, PER2, which are huge circadian drivers. Those are clock genes, and if those are aligned, it's almost like you're giving yourself better sleep without consciously giving yourself better sleep and allowing you to get more during your day. The interesting thing is eTRF amplified the expression of these, mTRF did not. Okay? So how do you put this all together? Should you abandon 16-8? No. I think 16-8 is a great baseline to do a few days a week. I think it's tremendous. I still think late and midday time restricted feeding are great. But whenever possible, we do need to do eTRF. I'm not trying to switch it up on you. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to give you extra things that you can do. So maybe 1 day a week do eTRF, and then maybe switch it up to 2 days a week, or split it somewhere in the middle. If you can't stop eating at 3 p.m., maybe stop eating at 4. Maybe stop eating at 5. But either way, the earlier we have our eating windows, the bigger the benefit. See you tomorrow.